Hello and welcome back to this informative series on the watershed of the Hughes River, Part 2. Today I'm going to be talking about water quality, NPDES discharges, and the overall impairment in the watershed. I'll start out by talking about water quality and habitat, per TMDL data. For this water quality data, I used a station at mile point 1.5 on the Hughes River, and this sample was taken on September 25th of 2014 as a secondary visit for TMDL, and it includes not just field values and lab values, but also habitat assessment, and later there will be macroinvertebrate data for this site. So, in these field values, measured with a sonde in the field, the most out of the ordinary thing appears to be the relatively low dissolved oxygen. However, this value is not out of compliance with state regulations, which only state for the dissolved oxygen to never drop below 5 milligrams per liter. And when you see pictures of this stream later in the video, you'll understand why there's not a whole lot of dissolved oxygen. This slide has a sampling of water quality values from the lab data for this site. Unfortunately, the fecal coliform data was not present for the actual biological sample that happened in September, so I've got the fecal coliform value from July at the initial visit, and it came out to 273 colony-forming units per 100 milliliter. The iron was 0.43 milligrams per liter, and the dissolved iron was 0.03 milligrams per liter. Aluminum came in at 1.75 milligrams per liter. Chloride was 12.4 milligrams per liter. Sulfate was 7.24 milligrams per liter. Total suspended solids was 4 milligrams per liter, and total dissolved solids was 102 milligrams per liter. Nitrate and nitrite total was 0.043 milligrams per liter. Total manganese was 0.085 milligrams per liter, and selenium came in at less than 0.001 milligrams per liter. These scores come from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection's Rapid Habitat Assessment Form. This protocol assigns point values to different qualities such as embeddedness and bank stability that are related to in-stream habitat and riparian habitat as well. There are 10 categories, and each is worth 20 points at its maximum, so the maximum score available here would be 200 points. However, the Hughes River mile point 1.5 section of the stream only scored a 94. There are 4 categories which all the scores are divided up into: optimal, suboptimal, marginal, and poor. And unfortunately, the Hughes here landed in relatively high marginal. So it looks like the worst score here is embeddedness, which only received a 5 of 20 points, which means it's in the poor category, though on the high end. The sediment deposition, which means the formation of bars and filling of pools with sand and silt, is also pretty low as well, but it is in the marginal category at 7 of 20 points. Fish cover also rated low. In a slightly more average range, bank stability, which indicates the susceptibility of a bank to erosion and high water events, bank vegetative protection, and undisturbed vegetative zone all scored a 10 out of 20. The highest score here really was channel alteration, which indicates whether or not a channel has been channelized or rip-wrapped or otherwise altered for roads or bridges. The biologist who performed this assessment must not have seen too much alteration. To give you an idea what this site looks like, here's a Google Earth satellite image. The site where it was located for TMDL sampling is at the red pin with the GPS coordinates. This site is also sampled every other month for ambient water quality, but when that is done, it's done from the bridge in the bottom right corner with a bridge crane. For an even better idea what this site looked like, I took a screenshot from Google Earth Street View. This is from the bridge looking downstream towards the site. As you can see, there's a decent amount of sedimentation and sediment deposit on the banks, as well as sandbar formation. WVSCI, or WVSCI for short, stands for West Virginia Stream Condition Index. This is a system used by the state of West Virginia's Department of Environmental Protection to quantify and qualify the benthic macroinvertebrates found when a biological sample has been performed. Scoring takes into account the amount of sensitive taxa, the total amounts of taxa, the percentage of the sample which is made up by sensitive taxa, the percentage of the sample which is made up of midges, the percentage of the sample that the top two most abundant taxa comprise, and a family biotic index. At mile point 1.5, the Hughes River scored 77.29 on the WVSCI scale. At mile point 17.1, the North Fork of the Hughes scored a 78.83, and up in its headwaters at mile point 52 scored only 63.59. The South Fork of the Hughes at mile point 15.6 scored 87.66, and at mile point 47.6, up in its headwaters, it scored a 76.2. So, given all of this water quality and habitat data, how does the Hughes River at this mile point stack up? So, from what I could tell, only the fecal coliforms were out of compliance with the state water quality standards at 273 colony forming units per 100 milliliters instead of the state mandated 200. But the Hughes itself as a whole is impaired, according to the TMDL report, for fecal bacteria and iron. In terms of habitat, this site leaves a lot to be desired, with a marginal score of 94. The areas that seem to be most in need of improvement involve sediment or erosion, and also there seems to be a glaring lack of fish habitat. Other things certainly seem to need to be improved upon, however, I would personally focus on erosional issues. And now, a discussion of WVSCI scores. So, ratings for WVSCI scores go from severely impaired, moderately impaired, slightly impaired, good unimpaired, very good unimpaired, and excellent unimpaired, to give you an impression of what we're dealing with here. The Hughes site, which I have been discussing in water quality and habitat, has been rated a good unimpaired site. The downstream site on the North Fork also came out as good unimpaired, as did the upstream site on the South Fork. The downstream South Fork site came out as excellent unimpaired, so it's got something good going on there. And the upstream North Fork site came out as impaired, but only slightly. Next, I'm going to talk about NPDES permits in this watershed, or permitted discharges. So, when it comes to actual numbers of NPDES, I was able to find the 61 NPDES permits used for TMDL modeling for metals and fecal coliforms, and there were 29 in this watershed labeled industrial. 5 of those were for the Department of Highways, 9 were for hydrostatic testing, 14 were for stormwater, and 1 was an individual permit. 32 other permits were for sewage, 5 were industrial publicly owned treatment works, 24 were home aeration units, and 4 were general sewage. I also found that there were 22 general construction stormwater permits issued under 1 general permit, and 53 oil and gas construction stormwater permits. issued under one general permit. For this slide, I've overlaid a map of the sub-watersheds in the Hughes from the TMDL report over the West Virginia DEP's GIS program report of all the NPDES permits in the area. I believe the pink dots are sewage-related permits and the green ones are industrial. For a discrete example, I've chosen the Department of Highways permitted discharge into Elliott's Run at the Marietta Run stockpile in Cairo, West Virginia. It's Cairo. I always mispronounce it. The permit number is WVG9-80026. For this table, I've juxtaposed the parameters that the Department of Environmental Protection requires and the actual values measured from the effluent. As you can see, all of the values here that were measured are within compliance, and some are so low they're non-detect. That's what the ND stands for in the measured column. The pH was not reported in the lab report. Now I'll go back and discuss impairment a little more. I know I touched on this in the last video that I posted, but I'll go back to it again now that you know a little more about the water quality. As I mentioned in my previous video, there were 186 streams that had TMDLs developed for them. 9 were impaired just by fecal coliforms, 86 were impaired just by iron, and 81 were impaired by both. And the stressors identified for these particular impairments came from sedimentation, that was where the iron came from, and organic enrichment was where they were tracing the fecal bacteria to. And they also decided that the fecal bacteria was coming from urban and residential runoff, agricultural runoff, and also background wildlife. The iron loading from sedimentation came from, they expect, forestry, oil and gas, roads, agriculture, stream bank erosion, urban runoff, and construction. Because permitted discharges are very rarely the only thing causing stressors and impairments in streams, here's a map of non-point sources for metals in the watershed from the Tetra Tech TMDL report. On a slightly more disgusting note, this is a modeled map that shows the different counts of fecal bacteria that the model attributed to failing septic tanks in the watershed. Finally, this is a figure from the final TMDL report that shows what the modeled TMDL changes could hopefully produce as an endpoint in the values measured for iron and fecal coliforms. And these are my resources. My images were credited in slide. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.